Knechtel speaking.
First, I'm going to ask your indulgence in two factors. One of which is that I prefer sitting down, if you don't mind, while I'm talking to you. I get tired out. And the other is, if anyone doesn't hear me, I think my voice is such that it'll carry. Wave. I'll try to raise my voice so that you can hear. In this room, I believe the acoustics are such that you shouldn't have too much problem that way. Now, I'm not going to try to give you any lecture. In fact, I never prepare to give anybody a lecture on anything. I'd rather that we just talk about a few things and give you a brief outline of the Indian heritage of this area and of Bruce County. Now, every indication should be that there should be finds of Indian artifacts in this area, because the Indians were here for many thousands of years. You are located at what one might be able to call a meeting of the waters. For here at Paisley, you have the Saugeen River coming through. The Teeswater River joins up here at your town, and I believe Deer Creek comes in this immediate area too, with its Vestra branch. Then, of course, there's Willow Creek, which I believe is over in that direction. And then just below Paisley here, the north branch of the Saugeen comes in. This means that through these waterways, which were the Indian highways, they had access to marvelous and very large hunting areas. And just why we don't find artifacts. In fact, I've never been able even to find any Indian names closely associated with Paisley. I think we know the Indians were here. I think we will find artifacts which are Indian relics, or whatever you want to call them, but probably not in any great abundance, just in scattered areas. It might interest you to know that there were some reports that there was a powwow point at the entrance of Deer Creek with the Saugeen River. It had some Indian problems there, in that it apparently was a point at which the Indians met to distribute their hunting territories. Now, these hunting territories were wintering areas, and the Indians wintered inland, whereas their main summer places were at the mouths of the rivers along the lake, like at the Saugeen and some of the other rivers. The reason for this was that the fish were very abundant seasonally along the lake shore, both in the spring run and in the fall with the lake trout. And this afforded easy and good fishing. Again, too, we often think of the Saugeen River as just a stream. Actually, it was a road that was used at least 1000 BC, for we have indications that the Indians came up the Saugeen and transferred over to the Grand River and went down to Lake Erie. And the first indication we had of this would be about 1000 BC, now possibly earlier than that. So for nearly 3,000 years, that Saugeen Grand River route was used by the Indians in moving back and forth in the country here. There's also a vague mention of an overland route. This overland route was used in about 1838 after the Treaty of Chicago by a group of Indians, Potawatomis and Tawas and so on, who were dissatisfied with the Treaty of Chicago and took the long trek all the way from Chicago up through Sarnia and into Ontario, and passed up through Chepstow and Cargill, and no doubt Paisley on their way to Southampton and to Owen Sound. There are some Indian names, by the way, connected with both Chepstow and Cargill. That's what makes me wonder about Paisley. Now, some years ago, and this goes back to 1935 or 40, Thomas E. Lee, who was then an archaeologist with the National Museum of Ottawa, along with myself and a few others, such as Dr. Jim Wright, who is now at the National Museum, we made a survey up the Saugeen from the mouth, trying to locate Indian sites or Indian artifacts, believing that this may have been one route of migration. We did find what they call archaic material dating back to about 1000 BC, but mainly on the highlands along the river and up the creeks. But on the actual present riverbanks, that's the higher ones, or on the older river courses where the river has changed, we did find indications of a later migration of about 500 BC to about 500 AD. And strange as it may seem, this was proved up too because a very similar type of material found in the mouth of the Saugeen has also been found at the mouth of the Grand River on Lake Erie and also at Ayr near Kitchener. Now, I do hope and I wish that if anyone knows of any Indian site or any Indian relic or any Indian artifact or any Indian name that applies to this area, that they let me know. We are hoping that this coming summer a further archaeological survey will be made of all of Bruce County. Now, in Canada, we have to accept the premises that man first came across from Siberia on a land bridge which existed approximately 40,000 years ago. The Indians, or their forefathers, if you can call them Indians at that time, were big game hunters, and they followed the extinct animals such as the mastodon, the mammoth, the camel, and the horse across this land bridge into Alaska, and then spread from there on down south. There's some pictures here somewhere of some of these animals. This is out of one of these hills. Can I make this? You can just pass that around. You'll notice that I think 11 out of 31 of those animals are now extinct, and yet these are the animals that these first Indians lived on and followed down through Alaska into Canada. The first indication we have of Indians here in Ontario would date back to about 30,000 years ago, perhaps interglacially. I had the pleasure of working on the Shegowinda site up on Manitoulin, where we ran into this. The lake levels were then a great deal higher than they are now. And by the way, over the years, the lake levels have changed from 300 feet higher than they are now to 100 feet lower. This is important a little later on. Around about 9,000 to 8,000 years ago, now we can't talk of these Indians as tribes because we don't know what tribes they belong to. So we have to call them by something or other, so we're calling them by cultures. A late Paleo Indian was apparently here hunting in Ontario, And they had fluted points, what they call falsum points. They also were using a quartzite that is found on Manitoulin Island and the North Shore. And it's strange that while they used this for tools 9,000 years ago, we are still using the same quartzite in tools today, for this quartzite is used as a flux in making steel and is taken out of that area by the boatload. Then coming on down a little in time, we find that about 7,000 years ago, the lake levels were some 100 feet lower than they are now, and that a land bridge existed from the North Shore across through Manitoulin into the Bruce Peninsula. And over this migrated back and forth the ancient barren ground caribou. Now, we've actually found on Indian sites some caribou bones, so as we know the Indians did use them. Then coming down again a little further in time, from about 6,000 years ago to about 3,000 years ago, we find evidence of a later archaic people, an early people. But unfortunately, we don't know too much about them, as we haven't found any really good sites or too many of their artifacts. Now, we come down to about 3,000 years ago, and we're beginning to talk Turkey before we can tell you a little more about things from there on. This is the archaic peoples in Bruce. We have actual carbon-14 dating, which is a means of dating from carbon that I think your science has probably told you about, of 1,000 to 1,500 BC in Bruce County. And their camping sites of these earlier people exist at Inverhuron, Douglas Point, and many other places in Bruce. Now, these people didn't use the bow and arrow, and they didn't use pottery. And they had in Bruce County a distinctive tool, which was a strike-off of a round boulder, just one massive blow. And you can see here where it was hit, and then there's the bulb of percussion here, and this one side was the work edge. Now, this tool was difficult to sell to the professional archaeologists because it wasn't known in any abundance. On some sites in Bruce, we have hundreds of them, so that we know that they were used, and in some cases we sharpened. You can cut up to a 2-inch limb with one of these quite easily. It also can be used for scaling fish and cutting up fish. Would one of you girls want to pass this around? So there's an item right from Bruce County here that's approximately 3,000 years old and was made and used by man. Then we come down a little further in time to an early woodlands people. And in Bruce we have the best sites in Ontario of this period. It was a hunting economy. And as I mentioned, before the use of the bow and arrow. Now you might wonder why I said before the use of the bow and arrow. First place, on their sites, we'd never find pottery. So we presume they weren't using it. In the second place, we never find small points like that. Or that's about as big as an arrowhead should be. Now people will call anything an arrowhead. I think that you can see from there, I can't pass this around too well, these two at the bottom here, they're much larger. So anybody that knows anything about archery knows that you can't tie a big hunk of stone on the end of the arrow and shoot it at it. This won't go. So where you only find these big points, you know that they were using the spear. Possibly the spear was a throwing stick like the Australian Aborigine, or were casting it on a short handle as a knife. But where you find these little fellows like this, you know that they were probably using the bow and arrow, because those could be put on the end of an arrow and you could project them somewhere. Do you want to pass these around? You can come and look at this one afterwards. In other words, these woodland peoples of about up to about 1000 BC were a hunting and a fishing economy and used the spear and the throwing stick. They used fish traps and nets and hunted the caribou, the puma, the raven, the bear, the moose, and the passenger pigeon. They kept mainly to the larger fish such as sturgeon and lake trout and the drumhead. I've shown you the bust off there because I think that is an interesting item. Then around about 500 BC to about 500 AD, we find a new people seem to have come into the area or developed out of the old. These were called the mid-woodland people. They knew the bow and arrow and used it. And they also used the first pottery here in Ontario. There are many sites of this culture in Bruce. One particularly near the mouth of the Saugeen, on which we find post molds indicating a more settled habitation there. It's strange, but you put a post in the ground, and from some of you people that are farming will know this, even when the post rots out, it'll leave its mark behind it. In other words, these post molds, there's nothing left of the post, it's filled in, but you can see these round, discolored marks in the ground, and they'll stay there for centuries. In fact, on the one site that I'm talking about, there's post molds indicating posts that were put in the ground for a house dating back to 500 BC. So that's maybe 2,500 years ago. Somewhere around about 500 AD and until around 1200 AD, another people seem to be here in Bruce. But here again, we don't know too much about them. We found thin lenses of their cultural material between the earlier and the later peoples, but we haven't as yet known too much about them. Now we can start calling people by tribes, but we immediately get into trouble, because as soon as I say Iroquoian, you're going to think of Iroquois. Now the Iroquois proper were the 5 nations, consisting of the Mohawks, the Cayuse, etc. But Iroquoian means similar peoples. Now, Iroquoian peoples differed from the earlier hunting peoples in that they went for villages, they had fields of corn, and they went farming. In fact, there were our first farmers here in Bruce. So you'll have to, when I use the word Iroquoian, this covers such people as the Hurons, the Eries, and the Tobacco Nation, and so on, that we know of today. Now, there's been a dispute, and as an amateur, I don't want to get into a hassle with some of these professionals on some of these things, that these Iroquoian peoples originated out of earlier peoples, and the other story is that they came in from somewhere else. I have a tendency to think that they just evolved out of the earlier peoples here. In Bruce County, I believe our earlier ones were ancestral, such as at Nodwell, to the later Tobacco Nation and the Hurons. There is a map here, I'll pass it around. This is a condensed map, a simplified map of the Nodwell site at Port Elgin, which we are frantically hoping to preserve and just as frantically hoping to rebuild as an educational and a historic thing for Bruce County. Now, each one of those little marks indicates a post mold, and you can see how you can outline the whole village there. In other words, there's a complete plan of the Nodwell village. I have a larger edition of it here, but it's too detailed to pass around, too big. And you can see where every post was in the ground for all the palisades and for the longhouses. Is one of my little girls available here? Try and be careful with this because it's fairly brittle. Now there's a piece of early pottery dating about the same time as that Nodwell site. Now you'll notice that it has a flat top rim and is somewhat different than the earlier pot. Now there is an earlier pot there with sort of a conical bottom. The Iroquoian or the Tobacco Nation pot had a rounder bottom. Now they didn't put these pots on the fire. They set them beside the fire, and then they heated stones and dropped the stones into these pots to cook. The pottery wasn't good enough to put into direct contact with the fire. That's why on some sites you'll find larger quantities of what we call firestone, the stone that's broken up because of the heat and contraction and expansion being heated up and used. The Nodwell site was dated about 1350 AD, as closely as we can make it. And these people grew corn, they grew tobacco, they grew pumpkin, sunflower, and a number of other things. They knew the turkey, of course, and the passenger pigeon. We got the maple syrup and so on from them. Everything went along not too badly then until about 1650. Now, I'm talking AD now, not BC, when the Five Nations, that's the Iroquois proper, came up into this area. And by the way, these were mostly the Mohawks, and they really clobbered all the earlier peoples, all the earlier Indians here, and conquered the whole territory and held it for many years as their beaver hunting ground, although they didn't settle here. They used to just winter here and hunt. Now, they didn't last too long, these mighty Iroquois. For around about 1670, some people say 1690, the Objoy, and I noticed over in the other room a number of books on the Objoy, came into conflict with these Mohawks and these Iroquois because of the breaking of a trading treaty. And there was many battles fought here in Bruce County. One called the Battle of the Skull Mound at Southampton. The other, there was another one at Red Bay, and they claim that the bay got its name from the discoloration in the water. And another one at the Blue Mountain. And the Ojibwe were completely victorious and held the area until white penetration and occupation. In other words, it was the Ojibwe from which we took over when we came here. I am leaving the Indian histories from the white penetration and settlement in the capable of the hands of others. It is the past, the written, unwritten history mainly. Actually, that interests me a great deal more than all these squabbles over Indian treaties, Indian rights, and whatnot of today. I have endeavored to briefly outline the Indian heritage and avoid too much detail. The terminology might be wide open to question, and the date arrangement is my own. I do not pretend to be an archaeologist. I'm only an interested amateur. And now that I'm retired, I've got a little more time with less ability to put into it. And I might mention that over half the sites that I've known in Bruce County have already been completely destroyed. Now this is important, for if we're going to find out anything of our past, we'll find it from the Indian sites and Indian relics. There's no written record. And anything you pick up on the surface, as long as you know exactly where it's found, that is, township, lot, and so on, and keep a record of it is okay. But do not attempt to dig, because when you dig, what you're actually doing is just tearing pages out of a book of history and throwing it away. Because there's so many things that an amateur it doesn't record when he goes bobbing around on the ground for artifacts. For instance, you're missing fish scales. You don't pay any attention to them. Very fine bones you don't pay any attention to. Discolorations in the soil people don't pay any attention to, and so on and so on. And yet this has to be completely recorded. We took out a child's site near Inverhuron. It was about 2 feet by 3 feet. And we started working on that at 10 o'clock in the morning. We finished off at midnight with a gasoline lantern. And we only went down 2.5 to 3 feet. Now every half inch, every quarter inch of that was mapped, photographed, and recorded. So that actually, when we got through with it, we could turn around and put everything back into that burial as we found it. Now this burial was of a child of about 5 or 6 years old, and we are not too sure with the date, but we think it was found about 1000 BC. And it had been possibly mauled by a bear or some other carnivorous animal, and some parts had been lost. The Indians replaced these parts so that the child would be complete in after life. This also led to some difficulties, or they got things mixed up a bit. We found some of the leg bones upside down. We found 4 shoulder blades instead of 2 shoulder blades. Instead of hands, we found paws, which we couldn't identify. Eventually discovered they were opossum paws, an animal that no longer lives here in this area. And around the child's neck was about 125 to 30 beads, like this one here, one of the girls around. And that is made out of the central column of a seashell found in the Caribbean, and traded up to this area and then buried with this child, so that the Indians traded over large areas. I've tried to maintain my position as an amateur in this field, mainly because I don't have to be afraid of being proven wrong. As soon as you set yourself up as a professional, you're open to question, and you lose status if you're proved wrong. But an amateur never does get any discredit for being wrong. And I found this really of interest, because I could make claims that a professional would be afraid to do, and let them prove or disprove it as they wished. I didn't care. And I lost nothing if they disproved it. For instance, I claimed that the Indians migrated through Bruce, that it wasn't a backwater. This was denied for years until they came up with this early land bridge, and until we proved the Saugeen Grand River route. Then they began to see the lake. I had an awful job selling that bus stop that I passed around. And I could name a number of other things. Now, if there's any questions, I'll be pleased to answer them as best best I can. There's a couple of other things I could pass around here. This skinning stone, I guess perhaps I don't have to. You'll notice that it's around at left and it's still quite sharp. And that stone there will skin out of here faster than any knife will. And in fact, up around Inverhuron, some of the local chaps there still hang on to these for skinning out deer and animals, because it won't cut the flesh and the skin as easily as a knife will. And that is still quite sharp. Now, afterwards you can come up and have a look at some of these other things. I'll just pass around these two things here. Are you cooking? That was a burial dug up at near Southampton last year. It dates back to about, somewhere in the early 80s or late BCs. And you'll notice there's three types of burials on there. There's the extended burial, then there's the bundle burial, and the flex burial. Now, each one of these had certain significance. And with that burial, by the way, much to the archaeological premises that they didn't believe in, they found copper pan plates for pan, beginning to stutter. 4 tubes in with this one burial, and also some mica sheets, and a skinning stone, and a number of other things.